Hi, and welcome to Monitoring DevOps Pipelines. I'm Tim Wheeler. I'm the Director of Engineering here at SquaredUp. And in today's session, I'm going to talk about monitoring Azure DevOps pipelines. We're going to go into a little bit around why you should do it, what things you should care about when you do it, some of the challenges of working with Azure DevOps, and then some of the things that I think SquaredUp does exceptionally well to really help you on your journey to monitor, optimize, and improve your pipelining and CI/CD experience. Okay, so let's get started and talk about the why. Firstly, just understanding build status, what the current state is of your pipelines and the builds that are going through them. It's totally fine to just use Azure DevOps or their email notifications when you have maybe one or two pipelines. But as soon as that starts to grow, it becomes a real challenge to understand exactly what's going through the system at any point in time. The other thing is troubleshooting. As with anything that you build in IT, it will grow and evolve. You'll add stages, you'll remove stages, they might become problematic, maybe the duration becomes very long. Monitoring your pipelines will really help you target which areas need improvement and how you should tackle it. There's also cost. Cost is always a factor in IT. So being able to understand what your pipeline uses and how better to optimize it can be a real benefit to you and to the business. And then lastly, your deployment overview. I think especially if you're in the situation where you have an application that might be made up of either multiple microservices or different component parts that need to be built separately or run by different teams, you can have multiple pipelines doing multiple deployments, maybe to many environments, and all of that together is going to be what makes up one release of your product. So understanding exactly what's stuck, what's going to lag behind, what's been successfully deployed is a key part of not just your DevOps practice and for engineering, but also when you're focusing on the business goals and how they're going to be met. You need to be able to understand exactly what's going on with your deployments. So let's talk briefly about Azure DevOps. So with Azure DevOps, they do have dashboards. However, they are quite limited. Here's a screenshot that I've taken for two of the widgets that I know work with your pipelines. However, they are quite limited. You can only have the one visualization. You only have a couple of parameters you can set to scope the data. And also, you can't do this across projects. So you are limited to producing these widgets on a dashboard for one project. So should you have teams or applications that are using different projects, which is a very standard usage in Azure DevOps, then you're going to have to create multiple dashboards. And then, of course, you're going to have to go to those different dashboards. Now, I have to say, Azure DevOps does have some good areas where you can get information on your pipelines, seeing test results, things like that. But it's quite hard to bring it all together. In fact, within the tool itself, there isn't a way. Most likely, you will probably run some automation, maybe to scrape that data, export it, perhaps end up putting it in Excel. Well, I have a different solution. And unsurprisingly, that's SquaredUp. So one of the things we pride ourselves on is being highly configurable and being able to bring data in from pretty much anywhere. And Azure DevOps is no exception. In this screenshot, you can see a dashboard where I've brought in many different types of information. I've used different visualizations. It's quite colorful to allow you to draw your eye to what's most important. And it's not just customizable in terms of the tiles, but the layouts, the sizing, everything you need to make a dashboard that will really have an impact. And lastly, it's worth pointing out that SquaredUp uses a data mesh rather than a data silo. That is, we connect to many data sources and we stream that information in rather than having to build a large data warehouse and all of the challenges that come with that. Okay, that's probably enough in terms of talking about dashboards. Let's actually go and work with some. So firstly, This is the dashboard I had a screenshot of previously. You can see here that if I asked, just going to go full screen, slightly easier. If I asked like how many releases are in the queue, it's pretty straightforward to find out that information. Or can you tell me if anything has failed recently? And this is really the purpose of a dashboard, right? Is to present information in a way that's very accessible, and you don't need to be scrolling through many pages of data. You don't have to be reading a lot of text. You want to bring it all to life. Let's do a little bit of dashboarding from scratch, just to show you how easy it is. When you connect to Azure DevOps, you can connect either with a personal access token, which means that that can be scoped in terms of how much access you want to the system, or you can use the Microsoft Entra ID, assuming that ID you've got has access to Azure DevOps, of course. So once you have that, we'll just create a tile. We'll select Azure DevOps, and obviously we're talking about pipelines today. So build runs here. So this is the history of runs. And then we get the choice of choosing a project, a folder, a pipeline. We're going to keep things relatively simple. But I'm going to pick something that I know has got some failures, because that's always more interesting. And once we get some data back, we have some parameters that we can set. So I could focus on a particular type. So I could be investigating maybe just failed ones. I can also focus on a branch, because obviously it's quite common to have many different branches that are just for maybe dev or test use. And then when you're actually building something onto your master or main, whatever you call your core branch, which we're using master here, then that's the information you're going to want to filter down on. There's no data, but there's no panic either, because I just need to change the time frame to 7 days. And that's how long it takes to build a tile. I could save that as it is, and I've got a table. It's got some colors to tell me the states of those pipelines, and it's got some information that's pretty useful. I can, from this point, do something to make this a little bit richer. I can simply choose a pipeline from a completely different project, add that in, and then realize that I need to take that out. And now I'm showing 7 days worth of two completely different pipelines. You can see one set there and one set there. I can sort that by the start time, so I've got the latest at the top. And I won't go into too much manipulation of the data on here right now, but yeah, you can filter this down to what you want to see. You can focus in on certain stages. You can look at duration. And I'll go through a few more tiles and a few more examples shortly. But hopefully that shows that even from scratch, you can build a tile. Possibly that's quite too colorful a tile. But yeah, you can build a tile seconds, minutes at most. And I'll just do one other example with this, just to show how we can also, just using the clone functionality there, which is always nice, we can also recreate one of the kind of common views you see in Azure DevOps, which is to bring in the stages as well. It's going to change this back to table. And just for simplicity, I'm going to hide these columns on the right here and just bring back the ones that I want to care about. So I just want to show how I've got a number of stages in this pipeline on its way to being built. And these are the stages, much like you would see in Azure DevOps, showing you the success or failure. And we can also turn those into what we call a state column. So if I scroll down and find, we'll just pick one, we'll just do end-to-end tests. And if I can spell it correctly, we'll just add succeeded and failed for now. Because I know there's only a limited number of values that can come back, I can map these to a status so that SquaredUp can show them with a color. So again, if I care about particular stages, if I want to get a quick visualization of how often the end-to-ends are failing, I'm now showing the health, but based on the end-to-end test stage. Again, just another quick way that you can get data, turn it into something that in a way that you want to see it, and display it on the dashboard. Okay, that's probably enough of building from scratch. I'm now going to just switch to back to this one, just to highlight, although we are talking about Azure DevOps pipelines at the moment, it is very common for a company to have a CI/CD tool that is different from where their repo is, that's different from where their incident management is. And this is an example where, while I'm looking at this project as a whole, I've actually brought in the PRs from GitHub. You don't need to know about that if you're just consuming the dashboard, but underneath, it's exactly the same thing. I connect to GitHub, I bring back the data, I shape it in the way I want it, and now it enriches this dashboard. So this dashboard is Azure DevOps and GitHub information. One other thing to look at is troubleshooting. So here we've got another project and another dashboard. And you can see that the focus here is on doing some analysis of the success and failure and duration of these pipelines. So it's a good example of, if we look at duration chart here, for instance, we may want to go through this and see, okay, I'm trending only slightly up, but my duration is trending up. And these are grouped by day. So this is the average time it takes all of the pipelines to run per day. And I can start to see if there's any trends, like, are we just very spiky? Did we just have one bad day? Because individual numbers can be misleading. So it's always nice to have a visualization to kind of back up the information you're seeing. Another example, or a really useful way of analyzing your pipelines, is looking at task failures. I had an example with a colleague recently where I was very much focused on the success of us deploying to production. So I focused in on those stages. I said, oh, I want to make sure I know when those stages are failing. And they weren't failing, they were all green. So I thought things were going very well until one of my colleagues said, we've got to do something about these pipelines. They're really flaky now. I didn't understand what they meant. Of course, I'd become slightly narrow focused on those deployment stages that I cared about. What I didn't realize is that several of the team were focused on these end-to-end tests that had gone flaky, and they were rerunning them and rerunning them and rerunning them. And I couldn't see that from the analysis I was doing. So that's why it is always important, I feel, to have a range of tiles showing you different information, cutting the data in different ways, and painting the full picture. So all of this might seem quite a lot to take in, and you might be concerned about how easily you can build these. Well, to help you out, when you first connect your data source, we give you what we call our out-of-the-box dashboards that appear underneath the data source here. So if I go to pipelines, it will ask me for a project. So we will go and just check this one. And here's just an array of tiles that we think are useful. They're quite generic. They're intended to be generic so that you're likely to see some interesting data about your environment. And from here, if you like that dashboard, you can simply click Copy Dashboard, and that will create a new dashboard. Or say there are specific things, like we were talking about failing tasks or stages earlier, I can select that tile and say, okay, yeah, let me build a new dashboard for me. I'm going to copy this over here. And then it adds to the one that we started earlier. Let's call this pipeline monitoring. And then I can go back and pick something else. Maybe I want to look into releases. And I could take this tile and copy that. And in this way, we're hoping this helps kickstart your journey by us sharing our knowledge of what we think is really useful and really helpful, and allowing you to build the dashboard you need to better improve not just your pipelines monitoring, but your DevOps practice overall. Now, one last thing I think is worth mentioning on this demo is dashboards are only so useful. You have to look at them, you have to remember to go and find your dashboard, and potentially you have to get other people to look at it. Another way in which SquaredUp dashboards are really helpful is our ability to monitor, notify, and share dashboards. So if we start with monitoring, you'll notice that I've got a few colored dots that come along here. And I will just edit this one. And this is maybe a slightly silly example, but we'll just take the state of the top one. So it will just grab the first pipeline result that's there. And we have an error, and then this will just refresh, and we'll get a red dot there saying, oh, well, when that's an error, I want that tile to be red. If the tile's red, then the dashboard is red. And then what we can do off the back of that is we can actually set up a notification. So on the left here, I've got monitors. And I can either monitor based on the state of the whole workspace or specific ones that I care about. So we just set up build runs at the bottom, click that. And then I won't go through the full integration, but then I can write an email, set up an email to myself. There's a few already set up, but I can add a new one. Or it could be Slack or Teams or basically anything that accepts a webhook. And if you want to go one step beyond that, you can even schedule these notifications. So in the example, for instance, of a scaled Scrum or Agile setup, you might have quarterly planning. Well, it's really helpful to have a dashboard that's going to give you all that information. You're going to want to use it every quarter. You can schedule that to arrive during quarterly planning or at the beginning or the day before or whenever you do your prep. And in that way, these dashboards carry on being useful over time rather than just gathering dust after you've made just a pretty dashboard. And then lastly, sometimes, especially in my experience in engineering, getting buy-in from people can be a little tricky. But what you can do with SquaredUp dashboards is use our share functionality, and you can restrict it to specific people or organization, or make it open. But by taking this link, I can send this to anyone who may be interested in it. They don't need to know about SquaredUp. They don't need to have a license, but I can send that link, stick that in a message or a Slack, and they'll get a read-only version of this dashboard. And this can be a really powerful way of sharing the information and getting buy-in from people, particularly if you're trying to get maybe more resource to work on these problems, or maybe you're trying to spend more money. You know, these are common issues for most IT environments. Okay, well, I think that's probably the end of the demo. So to wrap up, I hope during this session I've been able to talk a little bit about the importance of pipeline monitoring, how you can really benefit from that, how monitoring with SquaredUp, using our smart dashboards is a really powerful way to get the best out of the data that you've got in Azure DevOps already. And lastly, well, I hope you try SquaredUp, give it a go, and enjoy it as much as I do. So, as ever, thanks for listening and happy dashboarding.